Okay.
because we have to understand the transition. That, I was looking at this second century, and at the very end, I was looking at the second century with you, and I'd mentioned the Purusharthas, right? That was what we had been discussing. And the second century chronologically becomes an important time. The Purusharthas, the four stages, that some people think it corresponds to, and I was suggesting that there's no real correspondence to. But the Purusharthas are the four objectives in life. And I was suggesting to you that the second century, and then a little bit period after that, moving into the early Guptas, that's a period when the principal texts come into place, when they're really formed at this point. And again, I repeat this, I've said this often enough, but it cannot be emphasized enough because one tends to forget it, that many of these texts, so if you're looking at the Kama Sutra, if you're looking at the Manusmriti, the Artha Shastra, that these texts are themselves each of them is relying upon a body of knowledge that has already been created in that domain. And sometimes the texts are quoting earlier texts, but the earlier texts either don't survive or they survive only in small fragments. And it is in the second, third, fourth century that the principal works having to do, for example, with Kama, the Kama Sutra, with Artha, the Artha Shastra, with Dharma, the Manav Dharma Shastra, also known as a Manusmriti, that these texts really get formed at this time, while they are relying upon earlier texts as well, and sometimes they've been quoting them, and sometimes they've been including small fragments maybe from them, all right? And I mentioned to you that in the political domain, you can think actually of the opposite tendency. In what respect do I mean that? That here, if in the second century, third century, the texts are consolidating, okay, a certain view, that ideas of dharma, artha, kama are now being crystallized into some concrete form, and these texts will henceforth begin to exercise enormous influence. In the political domain, on the contrary, what you have is fragmentation. So, you had the Mauryan Empire, and then Ashoka is the luminary of that. The great luminous figure is Ashoka. His grandfather is important because he helped establish it, Chandragupta Maurya. But after the death of Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire, it's still there, it still survives, but its influence begins to recede. And then what you're going to have in the beginning of the and this process is happening over a period of a couple of centuries, and then at the beginning of the Christian era, or the Common Era, the first century of the first millennium, you will now begin to see a number of other political formations as well. So, the Kushans I had mentioned, the Scythians or the Shakas, before that there is the Greeks, right? So political fragmentation, you don't really have a vast empire now as you did in the time of Ashoka. And then when we get to the Guptas, so now we're talking about the middle of the fourth century, we get to what is now going to be another vast empire, which is really going to be the last great Hindu empire, at least in North India. And then in Vijayanagar, you'll have, in South India, you'll have the Vijayanagar Empire, but that's 1,000+ years later, 1,000 years plus later, right? And that really is a South Indian, it's in the Deccan, it's a South Indian empire. The Vijayanagar Empire never extends up to the north. So that is one reason why I've suggested to you why the Guptas become quite important in the Indian imagination, particularly in the Hindu imagination, Okay, so the Guptas used to be called the the Gupta period used to be called the Golden Age of India. And this was the verdict of many historians. I have a little quotation here from A.L. Bhasham, whom we have encountered before, who wrote this book. Very, very readable, although it has its problems, as I pointed out on a number of occasions, but extremely readable in many ways. The Wonder That Was India, first published in 1954. And he says, in the best days of the Gupta Empire, Indian culture reached a perfection, which it was never again to attain. Now, see, so look at the verdict, that this was the height of it, okay? And remember always that the idea of the Golden Age is an idea that only works in the dialectical sphere, by which I mean, it is only in retrospect that we think of it as the Golden Age. And usually we think of it as the Golden Age in retrospect centuries later, often, when decay has set in. Because the Golden Age has no meaning unless we also have some notion of decay. That there was a decay, India fell into a state of disrepair, disrepute, disarray. You know, the prefix dis is so useful here, right? This was an estimate that people reached centuries later, certainly in the colonial period. And that's when people began to look back and say, there must have been a time when things were really very good. Because where is this template really taken from? It's really taken once again from European history. Because for Europe, what happened? Europe fell into the Dark Ages, right? And so then Europe had to say, well, we had a golden age. What was the golden age for Europe? No European thinker ever even had to think for more than a minute to come up with the answer to that question. It was the Greeks. It was Plato, Aristotle, the great Greek writers of tragedies, Sophocles, Euripides, and then the comic writer Aristophanes, right? The historian Thucydides, and so on. That this was the golden age. So, and I'm suggesting to you that when people began to refer to the Guptas as the golden period, it was unquestionably the European experience that they had in mind, I would say, right? And A.L. Bhasham himself is actually very much echoing the view of many colonial era historians who took this view that the Guptas were the golden age. So, and he continues that this time India was perhaps the happiest and most civilized region of the world. And of course, we could ask, well, what does it mean to be happy? What does it mean for a civilization to be happy? For the effete Roman Empire, so effete is again an instructive word here, because it's not simply that the Romans had crumbled, but they had given into luxury and decay. And the men had become like women, they had become effeminate. They were no longer manly and masculine. Right? It was all indulgence. At this time, India was perhaps the happiest and most civilized region of the world, for the effete Roman Empire was nearing its destruction, and China was passing through a time of troubles between the two great periods of the Hans and the Tangs. And the comparison here is also not just with the great Romans, but with the Chinese, because China is the other great, in addition to India, it is the other great continuing civilization in the world. You know, modern European civilization can look back to Greece, and think of the Greeks, but that was almost a period that can be rendered as discrete. That is, that nothing of that Greek culture really, in a sense, is passed down in some, one could say, in some ways, right? It's like the epics that we were discussing, that you can't go around in Greece expecting people to know the story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, as you can in India, that you can expect people to know the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So it's a continuing civilization. In the case of India, is the case with China, which is why Bhasham is making the comparison with China. But I start with this quotation here because we would have to ask ourselves, how do we come to a real assessment of this empire? Do we simply take the view that this is a colonial assessment? But if it is a colonial assessment, well, the British colonizer and then And then more modern European scholars are saying, well, India did have a glorious period, and it was this period. So some Indians might say to themselves with great pride, well, we had this period. But how do we really assess it, right? Because, of course, uh, do we then just accept only those opinions of European scholars which are favorable to us and dismiss everything else? Right? That would be the logical question that I would ask to people who say, well, we should accept this assessment for what it is. Right? Because we know that the bulk of the European assessment of India was that India was a country that was stagnant and had decayed for centuries, and it had nothing to contribute to world civilization any longer. I mean, I haven't given you quotations from 19th century European writers. If I started giving them to you, you'd know to what extent the British just developed a complete contempt for India while they were ruling the country in the 19th century, right? So this is a problem for those who would like to say, well, we should accept, those verdicts which are favorable to us and ignore the rest. And I've discussed already the politics of this characterization. That is, where is it coming from? What time is it coming? What is the role of the colonial historians? And suggested to you that there is a European template. All right, but I want to reinforce the idea that this idea of a golden age is only an idea that resonates with us if we assume that there were obviously periods of sharp decay. And then the juxtaposition, the comparison, the contrast, all of this becomes far more clear. All right? And when we do say, even if we accept the terms of that characterization, then do we say that the achievements of this age were without equal in the rest of Indian history, right? One of the great Gupta emperors, the one under whom the empire the one under whom the empire became the largest in the Gupta period, Samudra Gupta, was referred to by a British historian of the 20th century. So Vincent A. Smith is writing in the early part, in the first half of the 20th century. Okay, and in fact, when Penguin did a 2-volume history of India 50 years ago, and the ancient period was covered by Romila Thapar, and the modern period was covered by Vincent A. Smith. So Vincent A. Smith, had been writing already for some decades at that point. He's really active in the 30s, 40s, 50s. He calls Samudra Gupta the Napoleon of India, right? And then again, you have to say, well, what does that really mean? Of course, he means to say that Samudra Gupta occupied the same place in Indian history that Napoleon did in Western history. Of course, we have to ask, why is it that Napoleon is not called the Samudra Gupta of France, right? I mean, it's always, the comparison is always goes that way, right? That Calcutta is the Venice of India. Samudra Gupta is the Napoleon of India. Mohandas Gandhi is the Christ of India. Well, why don't we reverse this? So you see, even there, the template, the idea is that you take the template from Europe, and then you see to what extent you can fit India into that mold. And this is the larger problem with which we started 2 months ago. And that is, how do ideas get transferred from one domain to another? How do metaphors get transferred from one domain to another? And what kind of periodization is involved in the idea of the Golden Age? So that periodization, of course, is ancient, medieval, and modern. And Golden Ages usually, by the way, are all in the ancient period, because then you get the medieval period, and that's the Dark Ages, right? It's which I have already questioned a number of times quite seriously. But it's no accident that just as Greece, and then we're talking about ancient Greece, was the golden age for modern Europe in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, there similarly, it is ancient India, and particularly the Guptas, who then become the golden age, for those who are looking at India, right? It's the ancient period. So this is what I mean by the politics of periodization and the politics of trying to understand what we mean by the notion of a golden age. And of course, needless to say, I'm simplifying here because golden is also, as an illustration, synonymous with the classic. Okay, so we think of the Greeks as the classic writers from Western civilization. They produce the classics as well, just as we say that the Golden Age gave us the classical playwright of India. That's Kalidas. We'll turn to him later on. And then, of course, we'd have to say, well, what do we mean by classic? What is the real meaning of that word? Sometimes we also use the phrase, you've heard it many times, it's a modern classic, right? So if you look, let's say, at a very good film that's been highly influential, you say it's a modern classic. But the word classic is actually in many ways synonymous with ancient. So that's where the complexity is, that we can say that golden has to be interpreted in a wide variety of ways, and that's not what we're going to do today, because that would be a discussion really on the politics entirely of what we mean by classicism, golden, and sometimes even traditional, because what is classical is also sometimes viewed as traditional, All right. One last consideration before we move to more concrete matter, which is that I think that one reason why the Guptas have become very important in the reconstruction of the Indian past is because the concern with the unity of India persists to the present day. The idea of the unity of India is invoked by politicians, it's invoked by the present prime minister, it's been invoked by every prime minister before. One of the reasons why a country like India, indeed any nation state, is so protective of its borders and uses that as a pretext to keep out various people is because it is assumed that the idea of the unity of the country is central to the dignity and integrity of the nation. And in the case of Indian history, one of the constant problems we are encountering is how do we construe this idea of unity? There are so many difficulties in construing this idea of unity. The fundamental difficulty is that there is perhaps no place in the world which is as pluralistic as India is. Right? When you have 1,000 languages, when you have a country which is the home to more than half of the world's religions, that is, it was half the world's religions were born in India. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism. And then you're saying that the Zoroastrianism, now India is a main place where it survives because it was driven out of Iran. There's a Jewish population in India which has a history that goes back to 2,000 years. And Christianity has a history that goes back to 2,000 years in India, 2,000 years. One of Christ's disciples is alleged to have come to India as early as about the year 75 in the Common Era. That's 2,000 years almost, right? And although Islam is not born in India, that for many years India had the world's second largest population of Muslims before Pakistan edged out India very recently. Now India is the third largest population of Muslims. And of course, remember that in undivided India, India had by far the largest population of Muslims in the world, by far. Even today, many people forget, when American scholars work on Islam, one of the fundamental problems of their work on Islam is that they really take the Middle East to be the place that is synonymous with Islam. But if you're looking at the world's largest Muslim populations, the 4 largest Muslim countries in the world are not in the Middle East. The largest Muslim population of the world is Indonesia, then Pakistan, and just a couple of million more than India, and then the 4th is Bangladesh. These are the largest Muslim populations of the world. Of course, India is not a Muslim majority country, but the other three are Muslim majority countries. Right? So, the diversity is without parallel, without parallel. And then, of course, there's also been the foreign element in Indian history for a very long period of time. Who is a foreigner, right? What makes an Indian an Indian? I mean, when you consider the Aryans, well, they're coming from abroad. They're coming from as we saw, from Central Asia and from the Caucasus Mountains, that region over there, someplace, right? They're coming there. Then we have the Greeks coming in. And then, of course, India is going to fall, and there are going to be number of Central Asian dynasties. The Lodi Gardens, which we had talked about before, well, who are the Lodis, right? And these are people who are Afghans. And so we have a considerable Afghan presence in Indian history. And then India is going to fall under Muslim rule for centuries and under British rule. There's Dutch influence, there's Portuguese influence. So this is one reason why for many Indians, particularly modern day Indians, who have come to believe that India will never exercise real influence in the world until it stays unified, that India has to present a unified figure to the rest of the world. And I think that's one reason why the crackdown in India is even more intense. It's not just the Hindu project. That's certainly a part of it. But it's also this idea that we can't afford to have dissenters, because India is a very delicate place. It's very fragile. There are just too many different kinds of communities and groups there, and it's susceptible to influences from abroad. So all of this also has implications for studying the Guptas, because the Guptas began to be viewed as a kingdom, a set of rulers who provided a certain kind of unity and coherence to the idea of India. All right, that's the broad framework. Now, what's the chronology of the Guptas? There's some uncertainty about their chronology, and we have to understand that the main material for studying the Guptas is numismatic and epigraphic material, not texts really. So epigraphs, of course, epigraphic material can be considered text, but by that I mean we're not really talking about long histories. What we're talking about is inscriptions. That's what these epigraphs are. They're really inscriptions. The inscriptions could be in a number of different places, including temple walls. They might be recorded in various places. And then numismatic material is coins, because we do have a huge number of coins that from the Gupta period, and many of these coins are in very good condition, gold coins, and the work on these coins is very superior. So it's possible to make quite a lot of inferences about who the Guptas are or what they did, and make some inferences about the character of the Guptas. So some doubts remain about their exact origins, as I've said, and their chronology. I think the earlier generation of historians all agreed that the Guptas are Vaishyas. So if you look at people who are called Guptas in India today, it's a very common caste name. The Guptas are really Vaishyas. These are people who are traditionally would have been involved in shopkeeping, merchants. They would have been merchants, mercantile, traders, that sort of thing. But there are some historians who suggest that it may have been a Brahmin caste. They're certainly not Kshatriyas, though. They're not Kshatriyas. And I would just like to remind you at this juncture what I said in a previous lecture, that it is striking that for hundreds of years, there are no Kshatriya dynasties really in India, around this time, before that, and for some centuries to come. Their traditional chronology is basically 319, 320 to 550. Okay, so that's when it begins. The early history goes back, as I said here, to 270. And when we say early history, we're saying it's more fragmentary. We don't know much about the people who might have birthed this empire. And if they did, they were kings among many others. They were not singular in the way in which the later Guptas are going to become singular. That is, that their majesty is such partially because of the expanse of the empire and because of the achievements that they have a singularity in the historical record. So that therefore the traditional chronology really focuses on 320 to 550, and we can actually say that the high period is 320 to 467. So to round it out, we're talking about 150 years. That's how long this empire lasted. You think of the British in India. The British first established control in 1757 in eastern India, and 1947 the British have to quit India. So that's 190 years. And remember that 1757, when they established control, that was only in parts of parts of eastern India, and the and what could be called the province of Bengal. Bengal in those days in the 18th century did not mean what it means today. It would have included large parts, for example, of what is now called Bihar, and even some portions, let's say, of Orissa. Okay, but the point nonetheless is that effectively the British rule lasted in India for as long as the Guptas did, for about 150 years. The Mughals, if you're looking at really the high period, again, you're talking about 250 years. So this is not atypical. You get dynasties that are going to rule for 150, 200, 300 years effectively. And there are five principal monarchs. Chandragupta I. These years that are given in parentheses, these are the years when the person reigned, not the lifespan of the individual, but the years when the person was monarch. So 319 to 335, and then on his death, it's going to be his son, Samudgragupta, 335 to 375, then Chandragupta II, 380 to 415. You notice there's a little gap there of 5 years between 375, 380. That's because sometimes you get these problems in succession. It can be contested. And then you have Kumaragupta, 415 to 455. And finally, Skandagupta, 455 to 467. And we'll see, obviously, in the course of this lecture, what led to the demise of the Guptas and why it began to crumble. All right. So the principal sources for the study of the Gupta period, as I said, epigraphic evidence, which would include inscriptions on temple walls, Samudra Gupta's inscription on the Ashokan pillar. So I'm going to talk about that because it's really quite extraordinary what's really going on there. And then numismatics, which are these gold coins, which are issued by the Gupta emperors. We have to think about how coins might be used to make inferences about the status of the economy. So generally, for example, you find that empires are doing well, or you have a very powerful monarch. You find that there's more prolific coinage. The coins might be better in quality. It's possible that the gold content is much higher. Then you can look at the relationship between gold coins and coins or specie, as it's called, in other material, which would include silver and copper. To what extent coins were the principal mode of exchange in the economy? Were all transactions made with coinage, or were they also made with goods? Did a system of barter exist to some degree as well? All right. So that's the field of numismatics. And we find that in the case of the Guptas, that there is a precedence in India for very, very good gold coins, and these are coins from the Kushans. So the Kushans, remember, we're talking about the first century of the Common Era, we have a fair bit of very good coinage from the Kushan period. Under Chandragupta II, you also have silver coins, and then under Skandagupta, we noticed that the gold content was diminished, but the weight remained constant. So it says it's also, there's a question about what's the degree of consistency in the coins. You know, if they're completely uneven and 100 coins all differ from each other in terms of weight and the precision with which they're made, then you think to yourself that, well, actually there wasn't enough of a precise, if I may put it this way, science of how to use, make, manufacture these coins. Cowrie shells were also used. We have evidence from some texts which seems to suggest that. Then the sources include the law books, so Manusmriti, because remember that, as I said, it came into place really about the 2nd century, but there's still material that's being added on, and some historians have argued that it's really the 4th century, it's really the Gupta period when this text becomes, takes a shape that it would have for centuries to come thereafter. But there are also other law books. The Yajnavalkya Smriti is a key example of that were used at that time, and we can make some inferences about social structure, the nature of social relationships in India at that time. You have literary sources, including the plays of Kalidas, who is viewed as the most prominent playwright to have come out of India. And we have the records of travelers. In particular, we have the record of a traveler coming from China by the name of Fa-Hien. And when I say pilgrim, I say that word deliberately because these travelers also saw themselves as pilgrims. And why were they pilgrims? Because they were coming to the land that had given birth to the Buddha. So these are people who are following Buddhism, and in many ways they are anticipating the kind of religious pilgrimage which has become much more familiar to us from more recent centuries. When religious pilgrims go to a place associated with the founder of a religion. All right. So these are the main sources for the study of the Gupta period. Here we have some maps here. So just so that you have a sense of what we're really speaking about. So if you look here, this portion here is the conquest of Chandragupta. So that's the person whom you can describe really as the founder of the empire, right? And then Samudra Gupta adds all of this portion here in light purple to the empire. So it was really under Samudra Gupta that the expansion of the empire was most considerable. And then this little portion here in blue is the portion that is added by Chandragupta II, who was going to succeed Samudragupta. But notice the large expanse of green here, because this is all kingdoms which the Guptas are not able to conquer. The Vakatakas, the Kadamba, the Cholas. The Cholas are very important, even much later on in Indian history. So it's important to see them this active, and they're actually active even earlier than what this map is showing, because this map is showing what happens to India beginning the 4th century when the Guptas start to exercise hegemony. But the Cholas had been active since the beginning of the Common Era. I mentioned them because they are the only power in India that really were a naval power before the coming of the Europeans. Now, you have to remember that all these empires that we've been looking at in India, when we're looking at the Mauryan Empire, then when we're looking at the Kushans, and now we're looking at and Harsha, and then when we're looking at the Guptas here, we're talking about land-based empires, land empires. But the Cholas had a considerable naval presence, and of course, given that this is a South Indian power, a peninsular power, so the Indian peninsula here, it stands to reason that they would be a naval power as well, because if you're able to command the coastline, that obviously gives you a huge number of advantages. The Mughals had a navy, but it was very, very small and almost inconsequential. And that's one significant change in Indian history with the coming of the Europeans. it's the beginning of what you might call the naval period in Indian history. The naval period in history, that you have a maritime power now, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and then the English, because it was really the ability of the Europeans to command the seas. So if you're looking at the 15th century, the 15th, 16th century, and why is it that the Europeans were able to make incursions into India? And that is because naval power had become the predominant form of power. It would have been impossible for Europe to have dominated the world unless they commanded the seas. They controlled the seas, which is what they did. And that is one reason why India is going to become vulnerable, because the Portuguese, the English, the Dutch, they're all arriving by sea, you see? And I'm only mentioning it in this context here because we're looking at the Cholas here very briefly and saying, well, who are the Cholas and what is their importance? All right. So this is what India looked like at this at the time of the Guptas. Here's a somewhat more detailed map, but this map has other uses as well, which I'm going to explain in a moment, because it gives us greater insight into the political structure of the Gupta Empire and the particular way in which they sought to govern the territories that they absorbed into the empire. So if you look at the key over here, it says the core area under Chandragupta. This is the core area over here. And you notice that you notice over here the Lichavis. So the Lichavis were an important clan in Nepal. Their name had surfaced during our discussion of Buddhism as well. And the Guptas are going to secure this northern part here by seeking a marriage alliance. It is always worthwhile thinking about marriage alliances because historically that's one of the ways in which power is enhanced. Wealthy people tend to marry other wealthy people. Men seeking power will often tend to marry wealthy women because that wealth is then absorbed into their own wealth. All right. And marriage alliances were conducted, not just in India, but all over the world, seeking this in mind. Because when two people's wealth is accumulated, put together, it obviously constitutes a greater force, right? The whole phenomenon which you find in India today as well, power couples as they're called, right? So that's the whole principle here. That's what the Guptas did was one of the Gupta monarchs is going to seek alliances with the Lichavis, with the women of the Lichavi family, and then once this marriage alliance is sealed, it's a way of securing yourself more territory and strengthening your borders. But this is the core area that we're talking about. The empire. This is the area that is synonymous with more or less with what for some centuries now had been called Magadha, because the Mauryan Empire was based in Magadha as well. So this is what this area is, Magadha. This is really where they're based. And within that, some of the main cities would be Patliputra. Patliputra is modern day Patna, right? And Prayag, which is Allahabad. Now it's gone back to being called Prayag a couple of years ago, because that was one of the changes instituted by Modi and Amit Shah. And then you have the city of Ayodhya, right? And this, remember, Kannauj was important historically, as we saw before, and then you get Mathura, which of course is still there, city associated with the legends of Krishna, among others. And then of course the city of Varanasi, also known as Kashi, the city of light, and more popularly as Banaras, right? So it's called Varanasi. I don't know if you know that, but it's called Varanasi because it's a distance between the two ghats, the Ghat of Varuna and the Ghat of Assi. So that was the traditional city, what was the traditional city of Varanasi, but also known as Kashi, the city of light. So this is Magadha. This is the core area of the Guptas. And then these are what are called, if the key here says border kings under Samudra Gupta. So Samudra Gupta absorbs these areas. I will explain to you in just a moment what is meant by border kings. And then The arrows here show the southern campaigns of Samudragupta, that this is, so he sets out from here, and this is the campaign that he conducts, and this is an attempt to annex some of the territory, which if you just go back here to this map over here, right, so you can see that it comes down all the way over here to let's say around Chennai, along the, but on the coast here, and then you see that this arrow signifies the route that he took. So and then this area here, which is in this grid here, the light grid which you see over here, you see the grid over here on this map here. This grid signifies the nominally conquered forest tribes. So by that, what the map maker means is that these are tribal populations. These are tribal populations. Forest tribes means the Adivasis. All right. So these are people who are not really living in cities. And these are people who are largely Adivasis, and they would also have belonged largely to different linguistic groups. So nominally conquered means that Samudragupta realized that, look, you don't want to get into an internal war with these tribal communities. They're very protective of their land. Everyone is protective of their land, but they're more protective of the land because that's all they have. And that's true of Aboriginal populations and tribal populations all over the world. They have a very special relationship to the land. And the land is not something that you can alienate. Alienate here means sell. It's not something that you can just sell, because you and I live in a modern economy where in this modern economy, land is just another thing that you sell. It, you put it on the marketplace, and you have realtors, and you make profit from it, and you develop the land and so on. It has no sacred meaning as it does for people who are Adivasis, and one of these days, if we ever resume this, it would be really worthwhile looking at the whole tribal cultures of India, which are enormously rich and about which we know very little. And what their conception of life was, because it's a very, very bad mistake, as which I think educated Indians do all the time, to assume that tribal people are just simply people who are uneducated and backward. Well, these are sometimes choices that people make about whether they want to enter into the modern world, and if they do so, on what terms they want to enter into it. So Samudragupta, I'm suggesting to you, came to the realization that you don't want trouble from them, but at the same time you want to keep them under control, okay, to some degree. So this is nominally conquered, that in a sense you exercise your control by simply suggesting to these people that, look, these are the benefits of not giving us any trouble, and we leave you alone, and you are not going to be hostile to my enemies. Because what would an enemy typically do? An enemy might retreat into someone else's territory to seek refuge. It's like a person going into exile today. So these nominally conquered forest tribes were expected to collaborate with the Guptas, with the conqueror, but did not have to pay tribute, right? So tribute is a sum of money that a person who's been conquered, a king who's been conquered, a ruler who's been conquered, pays to the emperor, to the Guptas in this case. All right, and sometimes what they did was they would actually leave certain areas unconquered, because it was, again, in their interest not to rule these areas directly. So the Vakatakas is a dynasty which is allied with the Guptas, but has its own autonomy to a very substantial degree. Now, what the Guptas did, I mean, I have another slide which sort of discusses that, but what they did effectively was they had this system whereby they created buffer zones. So you see, in a sense, if you look at this, so this is the core area over here, this is the core area over here. So these are the border kings. Now, what does it mean, border kings? It means that the emperor has decided that the acquisition of these areas and their absorption into the empire is useful and is required, all right? But in a sense, it would be useful to preserve a border, because beyond this, once you move into this area, beyond this, these are areas that are going to be hard to be able to govern over a period of time. Because the further away you are from the center, remember, this is the center over here, Patliputra over here. All right, this is the core area. The further away you are from the center, the harder it is to control what is happening when you start to move to the extremities. All right, and then under Chandragupta, under the Chandragupta II, these areas are going to be absorbed, but they're never really, because and so in a sense you could say it's a shifting border, because that becomes the border, but it is really this here which is effectively the border as they see it. That is, that these areas have been absorbed, but you can't really expect much tribute. So, from these kings. And so when you're actually looking at the history of the Guptas, you find that cities such as, let's say, modern day Delhi, for example, all right? And you remember that Delhi had been around for a very long period of time. So when I say modern day, I mean the present site of Delhi. That's all I mean, obviously. But areas, cities such as Delhi, for example, okay, they don't really figure into the history of the Guptas. It's really this area over here, and then moving into Western UP, okay, and moving north into the hills, which is where they had been able to forge an alliance with the Lichavis, and then somewhat down to the Deccan. That is really the extremities. And on the eastern end, of course, moving into what is present day Northeast India, right? This, by the way, would be now present day Bangladesh, where my cursor is, and then portions of Assam and Northeast India over here, right? So this is what the Guptas were controlling. Now, what are the highlights of the Gupta Empire? Because if it's called the Golden Age, we might want to consider what are some of the principal achievements and accomplishments. I think there is a general consensus that the Gupta emperors pursued policies of religious and political toleration. And I underscore the phrase general consensus, because I don't think this is simply a matter of thinking along the lines of Hindu nationalists and then suggesting that, we're looking for periods which would demonstrate that Hinduism was always a tolerant religion. No, I think that there is a general scholarly consensus that the Guptas were emperors who pursued religious toleration, even though, to move to the second related point, there is a revival of Hindu kingship. What that means also is that there's going to be a decline of Buddhism. But I don't think that this decline of Buddhism can be attributed to a war conducted by the Guptas against the Buddhists. I don't think that's really the case. So another way of putting this is that, and when I say revival of Hindu kingship, what I mean is that the Guptas are going to model themselves as Hindu rulers, and they're going to rule as Hindu rulers, right? So this is why the revival of Hindu kingship becomes important, because remember that in the preceding centuries, particularly after the ascendancy of Ashoka, that large portions of North India are going to slowly come under Buddhist hegemony. And I don't think it is an exaggeration to suggest that the Gangetic Plains was really Buddhist terrain for several centuries, predominantly Buddhist terrain. Of course, you had Brahminism as well, but I think that this was a period of Buddhist expansion. And so, especially for modern day Hindus, although I'm suggesting at the same time to you that that's not the only view to take, but for modern day Hindus especially, I think the revival of Hindu kingship under the Guptas is something that they find they can take pride in. That this was not only a Hindu dynasty, but it was conceivably the most important dynasty in India, certainly before the coming of the Mughals. And of course, some people, depending on their political view, might even say that the Guptas were more important than the Mughals were. Popular or Puranic Hinduism comes into shape. And by that, I mean, in part, this whole Puranic literature that I've talked about. The enormous storehouse of Hindu myths, the lives of of Vishnu and Shiva, the goddesses, the thousands of stories. All of this is really coming into shape. The texts that are going to give us all of that are really coming into shape. So this would include what you would call the Puranas today, of which there are a great many. And as I've suggested, at the same time, you'll find a gradual decline of Buddhism. The other highlight is, and we will look at these in somewhat greater detail, but the other highlight is the flowering of classical Sanskrit drama, epitomized most of all in the figure of the dramatist Kalidas. So this is the heyday of Sanskrit theater. And it is important, again, to mention that many of his plays are still performed, including, of course, most eminently Shakuntala, but this is part of the repertoire of many theater companies down to the present day. You find significant developments in mathematics and astronomy, all right? And we get some real insights into the structure of Indian society, by looking at some of the evidence and some of the sources that we have about the Guptas. So the last unified empire, I've mentioned this before, I don't need to reiterate it, is under Ashoka. And then if we're looking at the political history, which we went over before, that's what this does over here. It basically gives you a little idea of the kind of political fragmentation that I'd really spoken about, the importance of the Greeks, particularly with respect to the development of the school of sculpture, the Gandhara school of sculpture. You have modern day Pakistan, much of what is now called Kashmir, all under these Greco-Bactrian armies. And you have such dynasties as the Scythians, also known as the Shakas, and the Kushans. But all of this is beginning to disintegrate. By late 3rd century CE, the Kushans had withdrawn to West Punjab, and the Shakas are still there. They're controlling Ujjain, but the domain of the area of their control has really dwindled very considerably. And the early Guptas, so, I said to you, the early history begins 270, 271, with a man known as Sri Gupta. He's ruling from Magadha, that is from that area, of which Patna was the most well-known city. And his successor, Ghatkotkach Gupta, they actually they're independent rulers to a degree, right? That's why I said they're just kings among many other kings at this point in time, because they actually accept the sovereignty of the Kushans. And it's really only after Ghatkotkach and Chandragupta Gupta coming into place that we're going to find that the Guptas are going to become the hegemon, that is the dominant, power. All right. So we begin with Chandragupta I, who reigns from 319 to 335, generally viewed as the founder of the Gupta Empire. He describes himself in inscriptions as the Maharaja Adi Raja, the king of kings. Sometimes when you see an inscription like this, you say to yourself, well, he must have been a very mighty person. Well, I think two things need to be said. This is a very pompous title, and we do know that there were a fair number of minor kings who took this title as well. All right, so we shouldn't really make much of this title. And we have to remember the role of panegyrics. Panegyrics is, where you how should I render this word? So panegyrics is where you celebrate and felicitate people in very pompous language. The ambassador becomes His Excellency, His most renowned Excellency, His exalted graciousness, etc., etc. Right? You keep on piling one title and another. Panegyrics. Dictators love panegyrics, for example. So Maharaja Adi Raja, the fact that he is described in these inscriptions or describes himself, you can't really make too much of it. it also suggests that he might have had pretensions to be viewed as the greatest king ever. And this is a constant, not just in Indian history, but it's a constant in history all over the world. People who give themselves glorious titles and give themselves multiple titles, all right? So he established himself at Magadha in eastern India, forms a political alliance with the Lichavis by marrying Kumara Devi, and both he and his queen are going to be mentioned in the pillar inscription of Samudra Gupta. So Samudra Gupta is his son, right? And so the son is going to mention both his father and his mother in the inscription. And this is the dynasty I was referring to when I was referring to the political alliance that he's going to forge. So here is a coin that I was referring to. These are gold coins. They've come down to us, I think you would say, in pretty good shape. These are punch holes, which were quite common. I'm not a specialist in numismatics at all, but you can find very elaborate websites which give you good images of a lot of these coins with very detailed descriptions of these coins and where they were found and their weight and their dimensions and all of that. All right. So, but this gold coin shows Chandragupta I. So the coin is from the time of Samudra Gupta, their son, whose reign was very long, in fact. And then this is his consort, his wife, Queen Kumara Devi, who was from the Lichavi clan. All right. So this is, I think, a very good illustration of what I meant when I talked about the gold coins. I want to just also look very briefly at some of the other developments, and then we'll take a more detailed look at Kalidas, at Samudra Gupta's inscription on the pillar, and a number of other artifacts from Gupta history. So you have very considerable developments in linguistics in India at this time. There is a Sanskrit grammar written by Panini. I mention it at this point rather than when we were looking at the 4th century. This grammar actually dates back to the 4th century BCE. So this is really a grammar written, which is, composed, roughly 100 years, perhaps before the time of Ashoka, right? And 4th century BCE for a grammar of this kind is a very early date. So it's what's called a generative and descriptive grammar. And it needs to be said that even today, students of linguistics all over the world take this text very seriously as an illustration of what a grammar of a language should be like. Panini's, Panini, is going to write this in sutras and aphorisms, and then you have to interpret what each of these and recall what has been mentioned on many previous occasions. And that's one reason why we are looking at it now rather than at that point in time, that most of these texts, including the theological texts, religious texts, are always read with commentaries. So for example, if I was being trained as a Sanskrit Pandit, or even if I was being trained in Sanskrit as a modern scholar of Sanskrit and of ancient Indian history and literature, when I read the Upanishads, I read it with the commentary. It may very often be the commentary of Shankaracharya, from the 8th century. It may be a commentary of someone belonging to a different school of thought, but it would be usually read with a commentary. And this Panini Sanskrit grammar would have been read with a commentary. So it's actually read through Patanjali's Mahabhashya, which is another great work dating back to the 2nd century BCE. But the reason why we look at it this time is because it is around this time that these texts come down to us in some kind of coherent form. And remember that we don't have manuscripts which go back to 4th century BCE. The dating is really done on the basis of the language that is used, the references in the text. If someone is citing somebody, and we know that that work existed earlier, then you can make certain inferences about when to date this particular work. And one modern scholar has said that Panini's theory of morphological analysis was more advanced than any equivalent Western theory before the 20th century. So what we have here is, and this is all, of course, leading to this idea of the Guptas as the golden age, because now I'm saying to you, it's not simply this idea of a unified India, a Hindu kingdom. It does have to do with some other achievements and various domains which are quite different. So literature, you get Kalidas, in the theological world, you get the Puranas coming into shape here, right? And then you get works of mathematics, astronomy, linguistics, right? Now, Samudgragupta 335 to 375. And in about 10-15 minutes, I'll pause to see if you have any questions before we take up the rest of it. But Samudgragupta rules from 335 to 375. So we're talking about a very long reign. We're talking about a reign of 40 years. This is a reign which equals a reign really of the other great monarchs of Indian history. It's a bit longer than the reign of Ashoka, moving to a much more recent, comparatively recent time. It's almost comparable to the reigns of Akbar and Aurangzeb. 40 years is really a very long time to rule. So Samudgragupta is, the name signifies someone who's protected by the sea. The sea is up to where his dominion extends, and the inscription refers to him as, and then you have this long Sanskrit compound, which means the fame of his conquests extended up to the 4 oceans. At this moment, it may be worthwhile just going back to this map here for a second, because if you look at this map over here, it suggests to you that Samudgragupta had encompassed large areas which now lie along the coast, right? So the 4 oceans here is not meant to be taken literally, of course, because there are no four oceans. It is possible, by the way, that Samudgragupta may have come as far as a tip of India, come to the tip over here. It certainly was not absorbed into his empire, and therefore would have seen here both what then subsequently becomes known as the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, and of course the Indian Ocean down here. But it's meant to be read more. The inscription is meant to be read more liberally as someone who had really expanded his conquests so that it touched the waters. And this is where we go back to my earlier observation that when you really look at Indian empires, these have been largely land-based empires. And Samudgragupta himself, there is no evidence to suggest that he ever had a navy. Never had a navy. So the exploits take him to the sea, and he's able to retain those kingdoms for a period of time. But we're not talking about a naval power at this point in time. And R.C. Majumdar then describes to you the extent of the empire. And when he refers to Sindh and Gujarat, then what he's referring to here is, once again, the ocean there, okay, the sea over there. So the main sources for the study of Samudgragupta are gold coins and the inscription on the Ashokan pillar, which has been mentioned a number of times. Let me turn to that pillar over here. This is the pillar. This pillar should be familiar to you. We saw it before. It's the Ashokan pillar from the time, therefore, of Ashoka in Allahabad. And what is remarkable is that several centuries later, Samudgragupta is going to have an inscription carved on this pillar. And a millennium later, more than a millennium later, more than, let's say we're talking about 1200 years later, more than 1200 years later, the Emperor Jahangir is going to have an inscription carved on the same pillar. Now, you see, I think we have to interpret the significance of that before we even get to the subject matter of the pillar, because you see, in a sense, I had argued, and I stand by what I had said, that what is interesting is that when you look at Ashoka, you don't find any references, okay, to him for centuries thereafter, right? And then if you're looking at, if you're looking, for example, at the 5 centuries before the discovery, as it's called, of these European pillars, these Ashokan pillars, sorry, by the Europeans, and when James Prinsep deciphered the script, remember, okay, we're talking about the 1830s here, that for centuries preceding that, there is really no mention of Ashoka anywhere at all, none whatsoever. But the pillars were there. Okay, so the pillars are there. They were scattered throughout parts of the empire, and these are very, very conspicuous pillars. Particularly when we are talking about pre-modern times, when there would have been relatively few buildings to mar the landscape. You wouldn't have had skyscrapers. Yes, you had some majestic buildings, but those were few and far between, right? So now, why does Samudragupta carve an inscription on this pillar? Well, the most obvious answer, but it's not a very satisfactory or very political answer, is because, well, this was a very conspicuous pillar. And when he carves the inscription on the pillar, it becomes public property, because when it's a pillar standing in a public space, people can come and they can read the inscription. All right, they can read the inscription. So you could say that he did it for the most obvious reason, that this was a way to make known his views. But the other more interesting argument really is that every great sovereign wants to legitimize himself by invoking the legacy of some previous sovereign. Even modern politicians do that all the time. If Mr. Trump wants to be known, he will be known for all the rotten things that have happened, but that's a different matter. But he would like to be known, what? As someone who has inherited the legacy of the founding fathers, Jefferson, Washington. He likes to think of himself as a modern day Andrew Jackson, one of the, the president who appears, I think, if I remember correctly, on the $20 bill, all right? So, or whichever denomination it is. But, an American president who is well known. So this is what is really happening here, that you legitimize your rule and you claim that you are in the footsteps of someone as great as Ashoka. Okay, that's really what Samudragupta is doing. And this is what the Mughal emperor is doing 1200 years later, Jahangir, because he puts an inscription on the same pillar, on the very same pillar. So that, when someone went to read the pillar, they begin to understand, oh, this goes back to the time of Ashoka, and then you have Samudragupta, and now Jahangir. So it's as though Jahangir is inherited the political legacy of these two great rulers from the past. All right, this is what's really happening over here. I wanted to actually share with you the text, which I thought I'd put here, but okay, I think it's in a different document. But the text of this pillar, but it doesn't really matter, because I'll explain to you what the text of the inscription is. So one of the things that Samudragupta is doing is that he is renewing these old Hindu notions of kingship. I've suggested that. What does the pillar say, by the way? Now, so what the pillar does is it describes basically all his conquests, right? Which are the areas that he has absorbed, right? He has absorbed, the entire eastern coast, the region, of Orissa, or Kalinga, as it was known at the time of Ashoka, large portions of the Deccan, right? It enumerates all the names of all the kingdoms who became subservient to him. That's what it does. All right. And again, we have to interpret that a little bit because we cannot assume that he that he ruled these areas directly all the time. Okay. In other words, what we can assume is that all of these kings he subdued, whom he defeated in battle, are kings who are going to pay tribute to him. They're going to pay tribute. So tribute was a sum of money that you would send, at regular intervals, however they were determined by the two parties. So it's a way that in which the defeated king renders homage and acknowledges the superiority of the person to whom he's rendering the revenue. All right, that's what we can assume these conquests really meant. And what he's going to do is he's going to revive this old horse sacrifice, which goes back to the Vedic period. And if you remember the Ramayana story, it is actually these Ashwamedha sacrifice that was carried out by Ram. And some versions of the Ram Katha, the horse sacrifice, the Ashwamedha that it was carried out, where the horse comes up to the ashram of Lava and Kush, and then Lava and Kush, who are the sons of Ram, will actually engage Lakshman in battle, and subsequently almost their father without realizing that he is their father when Ram himself comes, right? But that was the horse sacrifice called Ashwamedha. So this is the sacrifice that goes back to the Vedic days. And the revival of this ceremony indicated once again the return of what we might describe as a period of Vedic/Hindu, hegemony. This is what it's really signified. So this celebration of what is called these round of conquest, that's a Digvijay, is undertaken through the Ashwamedha horse sacrifice. So he establishes a system of direct rule where you have places such as Bengal, Bihar, UP, northern Madhya Pradesh. I'm now using the modern terms for these areas. And then you have this indirect rule, that is the areas where the rulers are paying tribute to him, offering obeisance, rituals of obeisance to him, and where the kings of these defeated areas, which he's ruling indirectly, will agree to give their daughters into marriage into members of the royal family. Okay, all right. So you can distinguish the conquest from the conquest in Aryabharta. The Aryabharta is the heartland, the inner core, from those which take place in southern India, which is the Dakshina path. Dakshina means south, path is path, right? And then the neighboring states such as Nepal, which of course had also been absorbed to a great degree through the marriage alliance, and then in outlying areas such as the island of Ceylon, which the evidence seems to suggest came under the rule of the Guptas. All right, so this is essentially what is really transpiring in this time. I give you another map here once again now to refresh your memories, because here and all of these are different maps, because cartography is interesting too, how one thinks about it. Different cartographers think of different ways in which they want to draw up the map to reflect a kind of argument they're interested in. And so here, this is the core region that we've spoken about. I've used that word before. This is the outer boundaries of the Guptas. These are the Vakatakas, that is that they have forged an alliance, but they're not going to rule there, right? Because of course the advantage of forging an alliance but not ruling is that you get the benefits of security but don't pay the price for security, because if you're going to secure it in your kingdom, right, you're going to absorb it in your kingdom, well then you need to have an army there and you need to protect it. But this way they don't have to protect it, but they're not threatened by them because they're allies, the Vakatakas. All right, and then this is the outer boundaries, which are sort of, at times they're in the Gupta Empire, at times they're not. It depends, because obviously the empire is going to diminish once you get later into, the 400s. All right, so it's called the Western Satraps, and these here are kingdoms down here, further down south here, which are not absorbed into the Guptas at all. This is the Ashokan pillar I spoke about. Here you have a gold coin from the reign of Samudra Gupta. with the image of Garuda. This is the Garuda, the bird, right? You can see the wings over here. And these, I don't know what the precise gold content is here, because as I said, during the reign of Samudra Gupta, the gold content actually diminishes. And again, different coins may reflect a different composition. That is the exact percentage of gold as opposed to copper, for example, may vary. All right, and that's where you would have to really be a specialist in numismatics to get into more details about that. I show this not because this is a painting, obviously, from the Gupta period. This is the great late 19th century artist who plays an iconic role in the development of certain strands of modern Indian art, Raja Ravi Verma. But I show this because this Garuda that I'm speaking about here, this is a representation by a late 19th century artist. And here you see Vishnu astride Garuda. All right. And here you have another gold dinar. Notice the word dinar here. This word is still used for coinage in several countries in the Middle East, including Iraq. The word dinar actually goes back to the Kushans. Okay, it goes back to the Kushans, who were the ruling dynasty in India in the first century of the Common Era. And in this case, I have a little note which gives me the details that this gold coin weighs 7.85 grams. That's a very heavy gold coin, if you think about it, right? 7.85 grams. Its diameter is 20 meters. There are some other interesting features to this gold coin that we need to just very briefly look at. The king is seated on a couch. He's playing the veena. Now that's very interesting. The veena is a musical instrument. So one of the things it may suggest to us is that this was a king who was quite accomplished. He was not simply a person who excelled in political statecraft, right, and was a great patron of the arts, but that he himself was an accomplished artist. However, it is possible that the coin may be like, by which I mean simply this, that much as you have this kind of panegyrics that I was speaking about, right, where the king is going to, Maha Adi Raja Raja, the king of kings, the king of kings, you multiply, right, these panegyrics, his exalted highness, etc. Well, one of the ways in which you promote a certain idea of a king who is a great figure and who's ecumenical and he's broad-minded is you show him playing the veena. You show him playing an instrument. This doesn't establish the fact that he knew how to play the veena or that he was an accomplished player of the veena. What it does establish is that there was some cultural capital in being known as someone who could play the veena. That is, you earned some credit. People think of you as enlightened. And whoever crafted the coins, with the king's own permission, obviously did so with the understanding that this representation was the representation that the king himself wanted. We cannot infer from this that he was actually a competent player, or if at all a player of the veena himself. All right. Lakshmi here is seated. So this is the other side of the coin, is seated on a stool holding a diadem. Here you see, let me see where this here is a inscription. I don't know the language, so I'm actually relying upon the translation here. And according to the notes that I read, this inscription actually gives his name here and says Samudra Gupta. All right. So this is, I think if you see the coin, you would agree that the work of craftsmanship on this coin is really, very superior. I mean, you're talking about really extremely good craftsmanship here. And I may have one or two more. No, this is the last example I have. So I think that what I'd like to do at this point, because we've covered a fair bit of terrain, is to just see if you have a question or two before I carry on with the rest of the presentation.
Sure. So I'm assuming the expansion of their empire was done using what, military force?
Oh yes, yeah. You're speaking about you're speaking about military conquest here. Um, the question is an interesting one. It's an interesting one because uh, you know when Buddhism's when Buddhism expanded, uh, the Buddha, the Ashoka even sent his own son. Remember, to Ceylon or to Lanka. Well, did he send him with a whole army? Not that we know of. No, not that we know of. Right? But is it possible to conceive of these expansions as expansions having taken place through other means? Right? I would say not really. No, we're really speaking of military conquest here. But the question, as I say, is an important one because when we turn in a much later period to what is really known as the Indianization of Southeast Asia, some of which was happening at this time already, by the way. But it's really much later on that we begin to get a more concrete sense of that. That the verdict of modern day historians is that no, actually, we cannot speak of the Indianization of Southeast Asia as having taken place through the use of military force. These were cultural triumphs, right? Cultural triumphs. But I think in this case, you are speaking about military conquest. And you're speaking about kings who pay tribute in return.
Right.
Yeah.
And what made them sort of powerful enough to do this? Was it sort of what you would expect, where resources, therefore larger army, therefore
Yes.
more weapons, all of that?
You've answered your own question. Yeah. Basically, greater access to resources, better organized armies. Um, the word modernization of the army might sound like we're speaking about a modern army, but there was always modernization going on, always. If it's an army in the 5th century BCE, that army has been modernized by the time of the 1st century CE. For example, the horse itself represented a considerable dramatic shift in the history of what becomes India, right? Because the horse comes to India from overseas. It comes from Central Asia, from West Asia. The horse is not an animal found in India. There are no um, bones that can be attributed to a horse before a certain period of time. All right. So, and with the coming of the horse, it meant that war, to the extent that it was fought at that time, would change, because a warrior seated on a horse generally has an advantage over a person who is on foot. They can, of course, outrun them, and they can also escape. They can run away faster. And then when you have mobile artillery, so artillery is usually immobile initially, right? It's on the ground. But then if you have mobile artillery, a mobile artillery would be like a grenade launcher, which you fire from the horse as you're riding on horseback. So there's always modernization going on of armies. Yeah.
Apart from indirectly or directly controlling these areas and sort of imposing a tax, so to speak, like the tributes, and so did they make any other changes to these areas, like culturally, otherwise?
Well, the increasing Hinduization, definitely. That would be the biggest change, Hinduization. In other words, if these areas are being absorbed, because then you would have to say, what were the religious practices of people living in Orissa? Orissa still has the largest tribal belt in India. A very significant percentage of the population of Orissa is tribal. And then if you go a little further west, you get into places like Jharkhand. And when you get to Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, what is distinct about this is that you have very large tribal belts, Adivasi groups. these are groups that in some ways you can imagine are the ones that are designated as forest tribes in that map that we saw, you see. And what is interesting is that to the present day, these areas are not really Hinduized to the same. Of course, things have changed. I mean, it was the incursion of Islam, the incursion of Christian missionaries, the incursion of the Arya Samaj in some places, and then, of course, of modern day Hinduism. But there are still substantial portions there which were never Hinduized. So your question, again, is a very good question. And the simplest answer to that is Hinduization. That would have been the biggest change. That doesn't mean that it was always successful or that the people necessarily fell for it. There was an attempt at Hinduization. And I think the more accurate way to say what really happened was, and we can even make this inference from modern day India. I think I gave you an example of that before. That, you know, if you look at many of these people who work in India's cities as maids, as housekeepers, as drivers, you know, they're all migrants, almost all of them. You go to Delhi, Gurgaon, Noida, all the maids, they're all coming from Bengal, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, all of these areas. Okay, and many of them, not all of them, many of them have converted to Christianity, for example. Okay, we have had a number of maids who had all converted to Christianity. But then you see, when you begin to know them and we get to see how they pass their day and which days they want off, then they'll say, "Aaj Diwali hai, saab, mandir jana hai. Aaj Holi hai, mandir jana hai." अरे भाई, अभी तो तुमने बताया था कि तुम Christian हो, ईसाई हो. No. Why? Because it doesn't mean that when you convert that you relinquish everything of your older faith. Not at all. These are people who hold on to multiple faiths, or as I think I mentioned to you using a different metaphor, it's having multiple life insurance policies. You know, because the whole idea of having multiple gods is you pray to different gods, and each god may or may not do something for you. You know, right? They don't abandon. You see, this idea that faith is exclusive is not an idea that has ever had much currency in India.